All right. And also before we get started, I did just want to throw some helpful terms and acronyms up on the screen, and you'll have these in your handout as well. I think that you guys are familiar with some of these, like HMIS, right? But it's just always a good reminder. When we say HMIS or client track, for our community, those are the same thing. Client track is our HMIS. If you see SOP anywhere in this training or in your handouts, obviously that's Street Outreach Program. Date of engagement, sometimes that's a mouthful and it's just easier to type out DOE in a reference. Same thing for current living situation, and those are two data elements that we'll talk about in just a moment. And then of course, data quality, when we're talking about data quality reports, sometimes you'll see that abbreviated DQ. So I wanted to put that up there for you guys just in case you needed a refresher on those. So let's talk about data elements. Like I just mentioned, the two that are required for street outreach programs are date of engagement and current living situation. We're going to take a look at each one and how to collect that data, and then also how it impacts your work, your reporting, and why it's important, you know, not just because HUD requires it, right? But there's a reason, so we'll talk about why. Of course, these data elements are defined by HUD and funding partners. You know, if you have any applicable funding that also require maybe some additional data elements that go outside of the scope of this training. So like I said, maybe, you know, if you're a PATH program, there are additional data elements because you're a PATH program that you have to collect, right? So this portion of the training will not be all-encompassing for all the data elements that your program might be necessarily required to collect. This is just for, you know, overarching street outreach in general. And remember, data elements basically just mean questions, right? A data element is a question that you ask your client, and then you put that information into the system. So first we have date of engagement. This is data element 4.13, and date of engagement is something I think that is sometimes kind of tricky because it's a little bit nebulous in that there's no one right answer for when a client becomes engaged in your program. So the way that we like to describe this is the client is expressing interest in beginning some sort of case management plan. I think that the data standards, the wording is something like the client agrees to a deliberate assessment, right? So you're intentionally sitting down with your client, going through the intake assessment. They understand that that's what they're doing. They have, wow, my screen just stopped sharing itself. There we go, sorry about that. I did not click a thing, it just stopped. The client has agreed to sit with you through that intake. They understand what they're doing. They're understanding that, you know, you're going to be asking them this series of questions. When you think about deliberate assessment, that's kind of what that means to me. When we say, you know, the client is interested in beginning a case management plan with you, that's something that is kind of determined by your agency in terms of when you try to engage that client, how you try to go about engaging that client in your program to begin that case management, begin that assessment, and sit down with them. That's something that would be included in your agency's data collection protocol. So that's why it feels a little bit nebulous, I think, because as the lead agency, MDHA isn't saying this is when your clients are engaged every single time, and neither is HUD really. It's just when you're able to sit down with the client and do that full assessment and they understand you know, that's what they're doing. They're starting to become more engaged with your program to change their situation, right? But that's going to be determined on an agency basis exactly how you go about doing that. So if you don't have anything in your data collection protocol about how and when to engage clients, then that's something that you know, I would highly recommend at your agency that you start working toward having some sort of protocol, so that, you know, as outreach workers, you're all approaching that the same way within your program. This is a one-time only data element. So this data element is collected once for the head of household of an enrollment. It's not collected for every family member. So if you were to engage a family in your outreach, the date of engagement is only tied to that head of household's record. And you only record it once. So you engage a client and they're engaged. There's no changing that or updating that, unless maybe it's recorded incorrectly, but otherwise they weren't engaged and now they are, and that one date in the system marks that change. So let's talk about when we can record date of engagement. If you're looking here at kind of like a timeline on the screen, right, of your client's enrollment in your program. So when we're looking at when to record date of engagement, it can happen at entry. So you can record the data element, excuse me, I clicked too far ahead. You can record date of engagement at entry if that is what happens with your client. If you, the first initial time that you come in contact with that client, if they become engaged at that time, they're interested in, you know, starting their case management plan, they're sitting down with you and doing a full intake, then certainly at entry you can record the date of engagement. That's maybe not super likely, right? Especially for street outreach, you're probably not sitting down and doing a full intake with a client the very first time you come in contact with them, but it can happen. Also at exit, so anytime that you're exiting a client, right, you have the option to also record date of engagement. And the wording in the data standards is that basically date of engagement can be on or after entry and on or before exit, meaning that the date of engagement cannot fall outside of the dates of your program enrollment. So that's why, you know, we've kind of got entry and exit as bookends on this time period where date of engagement can be recorded. Much more likely, date of engagement is going to fall somewhere in the middle of that program enrollment. So your client is entered into your program with as little information as you have, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then at some point throughout your building a relationship and building rapport with that client, they become engaged. So then you would record that date of engagement at whatever point that is. That being said, like we said, this is one time only, so you're not going to record it at entry, in the middle, and at exit, right? This is just going to happen. It's a one-time thing, kind of like a snapshot of that moment of that engagement with that client. What this looks like in the system, and I'll open the system in a few minutes, and we'll actually go through it together, and we'll see where to record date of engagement. But you can see here on my screen that I am inside of a workflow, and I can tell that I'm inside of a workflow because I've got this progress bar here, my little pause and cancel button right on the side of my progress bar. And I'm on a program enrollment page of this workflow. So this is the page where I choose which project I'm enrolling this client into. That will be a street outreach program. I'm going to check the box next to that client's name, and then if the client is the head of household, I have the option to record a date of engagement here. So this is at intake. Most likely you're not going to record date of engagement at intake, right? You're going to record it at some point later. We'll talk about how to do that as an update assessment. And it looks exactly the same as this. Same page, same place. That's really the only place that you'll see the option to record date of engagement. And again, I'll log into the system kind of toward the end, and we'll look at all of this in the system kind of start to finish. So let's talk about the impact of date of engagement, how it can affect different reporting, why this date is so important. First, for your ESG programs, you guys are required to submit a CAPR, and the CAPR is only going to pull clients with a date of engagement recorded. So it will look different than the clients that you get when you run a clients and programs or an APR, because those, the APR, the clients and programs, those will pull all clients, but the CAPR is only pulling clients that have a date of engagement recorded, and also current living situation, which we'll talk about in a minute. So a lot of times we get that question when you try to upload your CAPR, and it's like, hey, total number of persons served, you know, from January to May of 2021, it says that we've served 12 people on our CAPR, but we've actually encountered, you know, 100 people on the street. That would be because that date of engagement is not recorded for those other 88 clients. So if you have engaged a client, it's very important to record that date of engagement so that those numbers are pulling to your CAPR. The same goes for data quality reports. The clients are only going to show up on the data quality report, the aggregate report, when they have a date of engagement and a current living situation recorded. So same thing, right? You have, you know that you have 100 clients in your program, but only 5 are showing up on your data quality report. Well, is a date of engagement recorded for those clients? which I think a lot of times is frustrating. I feel like I've heard some frustration around that of, well, I want to see all my clients on the report. However, this is meant to be to your benefit because that means that data quality is only kicking in after the date of engagement is recorded. In other words, you're not responsible for that client's data quality until they're engaged, until you're recording in the system, yes, I've had the opportunity to sit down with this client and intentionally do an intake and collect this data. And the date of engagement tells the system that. So and tells HUD that as well. So until that point, until you tell us, yes, I've had the opportunity as a street outreach worker to sit down with this client, be intentional about doing an intake, no one is holding you responsible for the quality of that person's data before that because, you know, HUD understands that as a street outreach program, you're not always going to get that opportunity, and you're certainly not going to always get that opportunity the very first time that you encounter a client. There is a note here on the bottom. If you run the data quality report, I did say that they won't show up on the aggregate report. So that's kind of the overview that just shows you general numbers without any client data. The clients will show up on the validation file of that report, which is the client level data. So you'll see all of your clients on that report, and then there is a column on the report that has date of engagement. So it will show you whether or not a date of engagement has been recorded. So those clients who have no date of engagement recorded, you can see that on the validation file and see why they are not showing up on the aggregate report. That can also be really helpful for helping you to determine who does have a date of engagement recorded and who doesn't. And you can run that validation file for your data quality report to get that information. Okay, next we're going to move on to current living situation. So this is data element 4.12, and this is the other kind of main data element that's required specifically of street outreach programs. This data element is recorded anytime you have contact with a client. Yes, anytime you have contact with the client. Tammy, I see your question in the chat, and we'll get to it at the end. I don't want you to think I'm overlooking it. Thank you. So this is going to happen multiple times, right? We're recording this data element multiple times anytime we contact a client. For your, looking at this timeline, again, this is going to happen at entry. So when you go through the intake for your street outreach program, you will see the page to record a current living situation. This is also going to happen at exit. When you go through the exit assessment, you will see the opportunity to record current living situation for your client. We will talk about what to do if you don't have contact with that client at exit. Obviously, you're recording current living situation when you contact the client. So if there's no contact at exit, what do we do there? We'll talk about that when we talk about exit assessments in just a moment. The other types of scenarios where you would record this contact, this can be anything from a discussion with the client about their well-being or needs, which is going to happen pretty often, right? Probably every time you talk to that client, you're going to ask them, how are you doing? What do you need? When you're sitting with your client to discuss some sort of housing plan, so this is that case management of, what can we do to help get you off the streets? And then if you're referring them to any sort of services, anyone else in the community, if you're sending them, to another agency or to another even resource that's not an HMIS or not, not an HMIS program, that's still a conversation where you've had contact with that client regarding their homelessness, so you're going to record that current living situation then as well. Now, I know that maybe initially you're like, wow, I have to record this all the time. Let's talk about where we can record this data. It's actually really quick to record, so I know that it sounds like, oh, maybe I have to do this a lot, but it takes about 30 seconds once you're familiar with the page. So again, you're going to see the option to record current living situation in every workflow for your street outreach projects. That's entry, update assessments, annual assessments, and exit. You also have the option to record current living situation outside of the workflow from your client's profile menu. So we'll take a look at that in just a moment as well. All that to say, you don't have to go through a workflow every time you want to record this data element. So hopefully that is music to your ears, that you don't have to click through all of those pages of a workflow just to record this one piece of data when you contact your client. Inside of the workflow, you can see here on the screen that I'm in the workflow, right? I have my progress bar, and it's one of the last pages of the assessment. You'll see the page current living situation. You'll see the title of the page there at the top as well. And this is all we're asking you to record, or all HUD is asking you to record, excuse me, for current living situation is the date. If you're in a workflow, then the enrollment is going to pre-populate for you, and then you'll have the option here to just choose the client's current living situation, and then click Save. So 1 or 2 clicks, and you're done recording that data. Those current living situation options will be really similar to prior living situation or exit destination. So if you are used to recording those data elements, then you'll have a pretty good understanding of which options are there as well. Outside of the workflow, the page looks exactly the same, and you'll get to it by opening your menu here on the left side. You'll notice that I'm on my client's dashboard, so I've already found the correct client in the system. I open that menu, and under Profile, there's an option to record current living situation. So this is where you would go if you are recording that outside of a workflow. You know, you don't need to do an update assessment every single time you have a conversation with your client. We'll talk about when you need to do an update assessment, but certainly not every time you speak to them. So if you do need to record that, then you can do it outside of the workflow here. We do have cheat sheets on the website and tutorial videos on our YouTube channel as well that walk you through how to record both of these data elements inside the workflow, and then for current living situation outside of the workflow as well. So I will make that cheat sheet available to you all as part of the handouts of this training, but of course you can find it on our website at any time. And I do just want to mention here that the data standards go into a little more detail than what we have time to go into today. So if you have not read the HUD data standards for street outreach programs and you're regularly entering data for street outreach, I would strongly recommend that you go and read the data standards. I'm going to make that link available to you as well for this most recently published version. I know that it's dry, and I know that it's not the most exciting thing to do, but just to get your eyes on that information that HUD puts out, I would really strongly recommend you at least, glance through it once. And if you have any other questions, you can definitely come to us. That's part of our job at MDHA as the HMIS team, is to help our community interpret those data standards and interpret HUD's guidance. So we're definitely here to help with that, but I do just recommend putting eyes on it yourself as well. There is some quoted language in our HMIS cheat sheet that's directly from the data standards, and then I really was hoping to have the cheat sheet for date of engagement finished this morning and didn't get it done in time for this training, but we're going to have a cheat sheet out for date of engagement as well, and that one will also have some language taken directly from the data standards so that you can reference that without having to go to the data standards every single time. So when we talk about the impact of current living situation, this one is not necessarily so obvious, but this is really, really crucial for our clients. So when it comes to getting your client on the HPL, getting them prioritized and matched to the right housing intervention based on their needs, we have to, I'm sure several of you already know this, we have to have some sort of documentation of that client's homelessness, right? Your enrollment in your street outreach program, your client's enrollment, in your street outreach program can count for them as documentation of homelessness. So if the client is enrolled in your street outreach program, that can count. They don't need an extra letter. However, only the months in that enrollment that have a current living situation recorded can be included in that timeline of homelessness that's established by that enrollment. I'll say that again. Only months that have a current living situation recorded can be included in the timeline of homelessness that's established for your client by their enrollment in your street outreach program. So what this means is that we have a client that's been in your program for 4 months, and only 3 of these months were you able to contact that client, whether it was one time that month or multiple times that month. Only 3 of these months actually have a current living situation recorded. Then that means that only those 3 months are going to be counted as part of the documentation of homelessness for that client. So what that means is that 1 month with no current living situation kind of counts as a break in that person's homelessness, because we can't verify for that month that that client was homeless. So it really is going to be crucial for establishing those longer timelines, especially that we have that current living situation recorded every single time you contact that client, so that for the client's sake, their homelessness is recorded in the system, and this current living situation is what we have to base that off of for clients that are on the HPL. All right, shifting gears now from data elements, let's talk a little more about assessments. So we know we have to record entry assessments, update assessments, annual assessments, and exit assessments. Now, I'm going to assume that all of you on this call have, already gone through new user training, already have a little bit of experience recording assessments. So I'm not going to go through how to record these assessments in detail. What I am going to do is tie them back to these data elements that we've mentioned, and then talk about some specific guidance for street outreach that has to do with each of the scenarios of when you would record these assessments. Lee, I also see your question in the chat, and we'll get to that as well, definitely. So entry assessment. Entry is crucial. Entry for street outreach programs are absolutely crucial. So your client should be enrolled in your program at project start. And I know that that can feel difficult to determine because you might have a really light touch with a client on the street, but not, not engage with them in any sort of way. Maybe they are hesitant, they don't want to speak to you, or you don't get the opportunity. So it can feel difficult to determine, is this client in our program? Are they, is this their project start? So let's talk through the scenario. You tell me in the chat, should this client be entered into the program in HMIS? Tammy, I see your question. I'll get to it in just a moment. You guys tell me in the chat, should this client be entered into your program in HMIS? You met a client during street outreach. You only got their nickname. He goes by CJ. And they said that they've been living, around this area for like on and off 5 months on the street. Should this client be enrolled in your program? Yes or no in the chat. Don't be shy. I see a few responses coming in. Maybe we're split kind of 50-50. What do you guys think? All right, I see it's about 50-50 in the chat. The correct answer here is actually yes. Yes, this client should be enrolled in your program. And here is why. Tammy's question in the chat just a moment ago was, is date of engagement different than project start? And yes, they are different. So your client is enrolled in your program at entry, but then their date of engagement might come later. So let's talk about what that looks like practically. We've zoomed in a little on our timeline here, and we're just looking at entry and kind of the beginning of this client's enrollment. Entry should be your first contact with the client, your initial contact with that client, no matter in what scenario. That is when you record their entry assessment. That's when they're entered into your program, and that date is their project start date. Okay, there can be very little or no data at this point. That is okay, that's kind of expected actually. There can be very little to no data at entry. And what that means, this is specifically for you all, for street outreach programs. Data not collected is okay at this stage. I know in new user training, and most of the time we talk a lot about don't record data not collected. Ask your client all the questions. This is one major exception to that guidance. So at entry for your clients, it is expected that you're probably not engaging them at that point, and that's why your data quality doesn't kick in until the date of engagement is recorded. So again, at entry, your project start for your client is going to be your initial contact with that client, the very first time you make contact with that client. It can be little to no data aside from just the client's name, even a nickname or an alias, some sort of de-identified information, maybe I think in the data standards, the example is like, blue hat fits in Maine. Like if that's all the information you have about that client, get them into the system and we'll talk about why. And it's okay if you have to record data not collected for the rest of those data elements at that point in time. What's expected is that as you build a relationship with that client, as you build on their trust in you, and then as you build rapport with them, you're building on data quality. So you might go back and record an update as you get new information, or go in and edit that project entry workflow to record their full name if they give it to you, or record their date of birth once you're able to get that information. But it's not expected that you're going to get all of that at entry. That's okay. Then once you record the date of engagement, that's when your data quality kicks in. So it can be at entry, but most likely it's not going to be. It's probably going to be sometime later in that timeline once you've already started building up the data quality for that client and you've already developed a relationship with them. Then once you record date of engagement, that's when we would start to say, okay, don't record data not collected. Ask your client every question. And the reason for that is you are telling us by recording a date of engagement that you got the opportunity to sit down with them and do that, go through the assessment. So hopefully this clarifies a little bit about entry and what data is required at entry versus date of engagement, because I think this year especially we've seen a lot of questions about, we're serving a lot of clients, why aren't they showing up on our reports? And then also, maybe only 20 clients are showing up in the system when we know you guys are encountering way more people than that. And we know that there are more people experiencing homelessness in our community than that and living on the streets. So we want to see those clients in the system. And let's talk about the impact and why. So the first one here at the top is from a client's perspective. And I'm actually going to see if I can go, one at a time through these. When you record your client's project start date or entry, the first time you engage that client, what that's going to give us is more accurate and complete data in the system. So maybe not for that one client, right? We have missing data for that client, and that's okay if you haven't recorded a date of engagement. But the system as a whole is going to more accurately represent our community and give us a better understanding of how many people in our community are experiencing homelessness, because as soon as you contact them, you put them in the system. Okay? What that's going to do is also give us a fuller history of that client's homelessness from the very beginning. So, if that client, you make contact with them on the street, but then 4 months later you finally engage them, if you're not recording project start until you engage them, that's 4 months of homelessness that we've missed in the system for that client. Once we have that full history of homelessness, then at that point, that's when, that kicks in with the HPL and what we talked about with date of engagement. We're better able to match that client to housing and services that are appropriate based on their needs. So, if we're missing that 4 months of homelessness, that's a big chunk of their experience that might, be taken into account when they're being matched to a housing intervention. And ultimately, that means more people are being housed and their needs are being met, right? So all of this coming from just entering that client the very first time we make contact with them. Now I want to shift a little bit and look at it from your perspective as an outreach worker. And Paul, I see your question in the chat. That's a great question. We will talk about that. From your perspective as an outreach worker, when you record every client that you've contacted in the system at first initial contact, that gives the system a more, it helps the system to be a more true reflection of your work. So like I said, we know that you are encountering clients all the time. We know that the work that you all do is incredible, but when you don't put those clients into the system right away, then the system doesn't have that information to show. Putting them in correctly means that we're going to have more accurate reporting for your program. Which maybe, you don't run reports, so you're like, okay, well, the reports. But those reports are used to garner funding and support for your organization. So accurate reporting means more funding and support for your program, which ultimately means you're able to, do more work and then house more people. So like either way, from the client's perspective or from your perspective as the outreach worker, it really is crucial that we're getting that client into the system as soon as possible, and then relying on date of engagement to help us to manage that data quality. There's one more impact that I want to talk about, and this is just kind of a quick plug for our veterans initiative. So the message from MDHA to the community right now is we have housing in our community for every veteran. We will end veteran homelessness this year in Dallas. and we need the veterans in the system as soon as possible upon first contact to get them on the HPL. So if your only conversation with the client for now is, you know, hey, what's your name? Are you a veteran? If we can get a yes to that question, then that is, you know, going to help us a lot with this initiative across the community for the rest of this year of housing every veteran and ending veteran homelessness in our community. That's one of our biggest priorities this year from MDHA's perspective and from the community's perspective as well for the COC. All right, so that's a lot about entry. Let's talk about updates. Your update assessment is going to be recorded anytime a client's situation changes. That's the same for all projects. That's nothing specific to street outreach. The main thing that you want to remember is that you'll use the update assessment to record the date of engagement if it's after project start, right? So for updating information like you got a client's full name, you finally got their date of birth, their social, those sorts of things were true for the client at entry, so you're going to go in and edit that entry assessment to make sure that information is up to date. However, a date of engagement is a new thing. That's a change in a client's situation. Now they're more engaged in your program, so you're going to do that as an update assessment. For annual assessment, just a reminder that after 1 year of enrollment in your program, a client should have an annual assessment recorded. You have 60 days within that 1 year mark for the client to record that annual assessment. So 30 days before and 30 days after is what makes your little window to get the annual assessment into the system. Sharon, I see your question. Thank you. I will cover that at the end as well. And then finally, exit assessment. So obviously exit when your client is no longer enrolled in the program. I do want to talk a little bit about auto exits. So some programs have auto exits enabled. Not every street outreach program has that enabled. That's going to be on an agency basis, so your agency can submit a service request via SpiceWorks to set that up if you want to set up auto exits. But this is only going to be for when your client, they're only going to happen in the system if they are set up when your client just up and disappears. So you have no, contact with that client. They're just, now you can't find them anymore. Typically you just decide on a time frame. So after 90 days is kind of the average time frame. 90 days you haven't, had any contact with the client, you have no clue where they are, then that auto exit is going to kick in. If you do have auto exit set up, it's not an excuse to ignore a manual exit. So a manual exit is still required even if you have auto exit set up. If you speak to your client at exit, you should be exiting them manually and going through the full assessment. And that auto exit is going to be based on the most recent current living situation that's recorded. So that's another impact of that current living situation. That's how the system is going to base that 90 days no contact. So if you're recording current living situation at every contact, then we can rely on the system and trust the system to do its job and see that after 90 days, you've recorded no current living situation, that client's going to be auto exited. Okay, let's talk about reporting. So we've mentioned this a little bit already, how the APR and CAPR and how the data quality report are affected by the different types of data that you're recording. Just again, as kind of a review, the APR is going to be all clients, whether they have a date of engagement recorded or not. So these clients who don't have a date of engagement recorded and these clients who do, both of them are going to show up on your APR. The CAPR is going to be a little different. It's required for your client to show up on the CAPR that they have a date of engagement and a current living situation recorded, so you're just going to get a small snapshot of some of those clients, not all of them. Data quality report, when we look at that aggregate PDF report, this is for you data quality officers. This is the one that we ask that you submit quarterly, and this is the one that you should be regularly using throughout the weeks and months to find errors in your data quality and correct those. Of course, a date of engagement is required for those because it's not an error if you haven't recorded date of engagement to have some missing information for your client. So for that one, you're only going to get that small snapshot of clients. However, if you do run the validation file or the detail file, that's going to pull all clients. It's a good way for you to find that date of engagement for a given client, and that one's going to have everybody, date of engagement or not. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is deduplication. So let's talk about another scenario. You have a client put into the system. You encountered this client on the street. Well, we know clients move around, so they were encountered by you, and then at some point in the future, they were encountered by this other street outreach worker, and they were both put into the system. For whatever reason, you know, that client wasn't already found in the system and they were put in twice. And now we have two records, and we call this a duplicate. So what we need to do is deduplicate that client. We need to find a way to make sure that we're only recording that client in the system once. There are some ways to avoid this to begin with. Several of you may already know we do have the capability, you know, as the HMIS admins to go in and merge a client record so that we can deduplicate after the fact. But there are some things that you guys can do before that happens to avoid that duplication in the system. So the first one is search for your client using only the first 2 or 3 letters of their first and last name. We say this a lot in training, right? Hopefully that's familiar, and hopefully that's part of your practice and you're doing that on a regular basis. Searching for your client in multiple ways. So if you have a name and a date of birth, just search for like a date of birth and an initial. Search for only one of their names, first or last, and then review the clients that come up to see if you can find them. Search using the alias or some sort of other identifier. So we talked about, you know, HUD gives examples of if all you can get for that client is like Red Hat, Ace in Maine, then that's the information that you put in, and then hopefully someone else, you know, who's doing outreach in that same area, if they encounter that client later, they can identify that client in some way, and then, you know, then we can build on that client's record over time, even if it's not you, the person who entered them, who's putting in that information. Note, Tyler, to do these things on the screen, you do not have to be an admin. So searching for your client in the system before you do an intake for them with only the first 2 or 3 letters of their first and last name. Search for your client in multiple ways before you do your intake to make sure that they're not already in the system. And also search using multiple spellings. So let's say I have a client whose name is Joe. I search for Joe and I don't find Joe. Maybe I just search for Joe using those first 2 letters because maybe it's short, J-O, that's all. Maybe Joe is from New Orleans and he spells it like this. If I'm searching for J-O, I'm not going to find him. So search for multiple spellings if you can think of any, or even just use, you know, a first initial and a last name, or a first name and a last initial. As many ways as you can search for that client practically to make sure that you're not duplicating a client in the system. This is one of the biggest constraints of collecting street outreach data is that, you know, if we're putting in every single client every time we contact them, inevitably we're going to have duplicates. But using these strategies can kind of help to negate some of that on the front end. Now I want to hear from you guys. So I do want to open this up for a minute and hear, I'm going to put all 3 of these questions on the screen. You can answer all 3 of them or just 1 or 2 of them. You can unmute yourself or type it in the chat. What other data collection challenges are you facing in your outreach? What are you doing at your agency if you have run into some constraints or challenges? What are you doing to help work through those? And then is there any way that MDHA as a lead agency for our community can support you in alleviating those constraints? So I would love to get your feedback. This is going to be a really boring, you know, 5 or 10 minutes if no one answers. But if you feel comfortable, you know, type it in the chat or unmute yourself and let us know. How has this been going for you guys? What's going on?
This is the first I'm hearing that we can put in partial data. I thought we had to do a full assessment on folks. Used to, we could do a short form, but this is kind of new to me, so I don't know if anybody else, if they've been doing this already, putting in partial data. But I guess my question is, if we put in partial data each time that we get more information, do we need to do it, like if we get their social, should we do that search for the person to try to eliminate these duplications?
So John, if you're going into, say you encounter that client, you just put their name in the system first. A month later, you get their social. You would search for that client in the system, find that client, and then just edit the client's profile information. And we can walk through how to do that on the screen. But you don't have to worry about creating a new client to just go in and add information to that client's record, certainly. And you don't have to do a full intake to add that demographic information either. And I'll just say I know that a lot of you who are especially new users in the last few months probably are not aware of these different data collection requirements. And, that's because we've been working on building out this training and finding a way to get this to you all without making it seem like everybody has this opportunity, because everyone that enters data into HMIS does not have this opportunity. This is only for street outreach programs. So even if you enter data for other types of programs at your organization, this will not apply to all of your clients. It's only clients who are enrolled in street outreach programs. So now that we have this training, it's going to be made available to new users at street outreach programs, so they'll get this information right off the bat. It's just one of those things that it takes time to build out all of this content for you all. So I hear the frustration there of I didn't know this information before, and we're hoping to avoid that in the future. Did I answer your question about the way that you enter that data?
Yeah, I was just curious on if we just have an initial, let's say CJ, the one you used, and that's all we can put in. Every time we gain a little bit more information, should we be doing a search for that?
Yeah, you can also search based on the client ID that's created when you do the intake the first time. So if you can go based off of that client ID, then that's helpful as well. Go ahead, Tammy.
Well, I'm just really excited to share that as a new nonprofit starting from the ground up, we have finally raised enough money to buy 2 Dell rugged laptops with broadband service, so we can go out with these laptops anywhere and do our VI SPDATs or assessments live, which is really going to save us a lot of time. We haven't had secure computers before, so we just had to take notes. So I'm really excited about these laptops. Probably all of y'all have it, but we now have 2, and we just got our second one yesterday, and I'm watching this meeting on this laptop. I'm so excited. Thank you.
That's so awesome, Tammy. Thanks for sharing that. I don't know that all of our street outreach teams have the equipment that they need to do data collection on the street. I would be surprised if no one on this meeting said that that was a constraint for them. So, that's something that we as MDHA, we can't solve that problem for you. Like, we can't just magically make all this equipment appear. But, we, as an HMIS team, we're very aware that you guys need the equipment, and we talk to your leadership about that, of like, hey, this is important. We know that Client Track is not super cell phone friendly. It is tablet friendly, so if you have tablets at your organization that you can use to take out into the street, you can log into Client Track. You can, Lee says he uses a tablet and sets up a mobile hotspot on his phone. That works. That's a great solution for that. You can also develop some sort of short form, to just get the client basic information and come back and enter it later, right? You do have this year 2 calendar days to enter that information. So, it doesn't have to be entered in real time if that is a major constraint. And obviously, you're not just going to log off of here and say, I need a laptop and magically get it. So, using some sort of paper intake or a way to take those notes and go back and enter that data within those 2 days is maybe a good short-term solution for getting that information in. I do want to go back and see, so Sharon, another constraint that you mentioned is that people are only providing first names or nicknames. So yes, we can enter that information for street outreach. Obviously, we want to do some thorough searching, right? So if you get that your client's name is Sharon and you encounter that client and you search for Sharon in the system, and Sharon, you know, you're looking at the clients, you can, even if you don't have all the information about that client, you can kind of determine based on age, you know, based on race and ethnicity, like I'm Megan and you see me on the street and you can see that I'm white. If you find a Megan in the system that's Asian or African American, like that's obviously not me, right? So you can try to use some common sense there to try to avoid the duplication, but if you're not sure, create the new client. Don't add information to a client's record if you're not sure that it's the same person. And then we can do the deduplicating on the back end too. I think as a community, as we improve the quality of our data being put in at entry, then we will have some different constraints that come up in the future about deduplicating, and we can solve those we can come up with solutions for that as a community together, but I think it's important to get those clients into the system anyway. Lee says his biggest issue is that there's been very little data at entry on clients in northern Collin County. So running around to other organizations to get records of long-term homelessness. Definitely, Lee, I hear that. I think that, you know, as we're working more and more with Collin County and expanding, we have more and more organizations in Collin County that are becoming, you know, HMIS partnering agencies. And we have City of Plano that's newly in HMIS. So, you know, we're working on getting more of that data into the system. And I think that as we continue as a community to build our data in HMIS, then we will hopefully help to solve some of those issues. We're also at some point, Frida, I see that you're on the call. I don't know how much I can say about a data warehouse or like a database or some other way to help our community get that information, but I know that that's something that we're working on too. Can we speak to that at all?
We're getting a data warehouse. Don't have a date for it as of yet. Everyone, if you've been in our community for a while, you'll remember when we were with Pieces Iris, we had a separate data warehouse where data was uploaded to on a nightly basis. So it'll work similar in that fashion, and that we'll be able to do data dumps into this data warehouse. And so organizations who may not necessarily use HMIS, right? Maybe it's a hospital, right? That doesn't use HMIS will be able to have a more complete record of the client in this data warehouse. So we'll happily share more information with you as we get it, but that is something that that's in the works and should happen this year. I just don't have a date. Megan, were you looking for anything more than that?
No, that's good. I just wasn't, you know, since it's not like a set in stone thing and we don't have a date, I didn't want to speak too far ahead of myself there. But I think that is exciting. It's going to be really exciting for the community to have that, and then I think that will help with the data that we get from Collin County as well, because they won't have to be HMIS. They won't have to be entering data into HMIS to be able to make that data available to the community at large. Let's see, I'm looking through the chat for other constraints, and I will get to all of your questions. Thank you guys for putting your questions in the chat. We are going to get to them all in just a moment. I want to make sure I'm not skipping anybody on this section.
I do have a question about reporting.
Okay, we'll do questions in just,
Okay.
Yolanda, we'll do questions in just a second. I just want to make sure is anyone else, I don't think that we have any other constraint. I don't want to look over anybody. Okay, Yolanda, go ahead. What's your question about reporting?
So to make sure I'm understanding, so if my team is doing partial, I don't want to call it partial enrollment, but is recording data not collected, it's best for me to report or to run a caper instead of an APR, correct? To know who is fully enrolled in the program is what I'm saying, I guess what I'm saying.
The client is fully enrolled in the program at entry. So that's one thing. I know, Paul, your question was like if someone just walks in off the street and introduces themselves because I contacted them, do I have to enroll them? So these kind of overlap a little bit there. The client is fully enrolled in your program at entry. But if you're looking for clients who are engaged and clients who you're being held accountable for their data quality, then the CAPER is going to give you more accurate numbers.
Okay. Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Paul, let's go back to that question. So Paul's question in the chat was, this is in regard to entering the client as soon as you contact them. He said, if I'm signing someone up for our program and somebody walks by and says, hi, nice to meet you, I'm CJ, then he's supposed to make a contact for that person that just walked by and said hello? Absolutely not. So this is for, this is where that data collection protocol for your agency is going to come into play to determine, we don't determine when a client is entered into your program, and neither does HUD. That's up to your program to determine when is a client entered into your program, what is program enrollment considered for your client. What HUD is saying is that engagement is not one of those requirements, right? So a client being engaged is not a requirement for entering them into your program. If you are serving a client in any way through your program, then that person needs to be enrolled. Me just introducing myself to you while you're working on outreach doesn't necessarily mean that I'm then being served by your program in any way. Does that, so Paul, your second question was like, even if we did nothing for him. So that tells me that that client was really not enrolled in your program in any meaningful way. Does that provide some clarity there?
Can I add to that, Megan? Because what I want to make sure that we understand, just as street outreach programs in HMIS, the expectation is that we get the client into HMIS with as little information that the client is willing to provide us, right? And we build on that information the more we make contact with that client, and the more information we're able to get out of the client. And I think Paul's question was, hey, I'm working street outreach and a client says hi to me and I say hi back. Does that client need to be entered into HMIS? If that client is homeless, if you're working as a street outreach worker and you do make initial contact with someone and that client is homeless, we want to make sure that that client is represented in HMIS. So, I mean, you guys are doing street outreach. I'm not. So this is where you have to educate us a little bit. Just because a client says hi, no, that doesn't mean that you enter them into HMIS. But if you're working as a street outreach worker and you are attempting to engage that client or see if that client needs a bottle of water, if that client is willing to get off the streets and maybe go to an emergency shelter, we want to make sure that that client a record is created in HMIS for that client, and then record current living situation, because that begins to create a record of that client in the system where we can document his homelessness in the system. So I think we want you to make sure that you're getting the client in HMIS with whatever information they're willing to provide you. But that may not be the appropriate time, right? Just because you say hi to a client, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to give that client a bottle of water, or that you're going to try to attempt to get that client off the streets. That may not be an appropriate time to get that client into HMIS. But the goal is to make sure that the client does have a record in the system, and that if we are recording current living situation when we make contact with that client, then we're able to use that as documentation of homelessness. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Frida, for the clarification. I feel like you worded that a lot better than I did. Tammy, I think I'm looking back in the chat, and I think that answers your first question that says, as street outreach workers, it can take us a long time to gain trust. You know, if we're meeting with them before we are actually able to do the full intake, what about all that lost time and documenting homelessness? But that is why current living situation is there. So current living situation is what helps document that client's homelessness. And it is tied to the enrollment, so that's why it's important to get that client into the system as soon as possible. Then you're able to record that current living situation, and we have that timeline of homelessness being established by current living situation, whereas date of engagement is where you're responsible for data quality. Hopefully that provides a little, go ahead.
I want to make sure I understand, though, because earlier in the training you said documentation of homelessness begins upon the date of engagement, if I heard that right. But what
it begins with current living situation.
so current in living situation is entered at the same time you do your broad red hat guy at the corner entries then every time, right?
Yes. Yes, we'll take a look at it actually. I wanted to log into the system and I didn't a moment ago. So let me log in and we'll just do this for a client from scratch. So I'm going to log into the training site and let's just really quickly enter a client. Let's enter our client Joe with his super funky spelling of his name. Maybe I have a client named Joe and I'm going to search for Joe Red Hat, right? Because I don't know any other information about him. He's not willing to give me his full name. Now I have a bunch of Joes in the system, so I could look through some of these records, look at the date of birth, if I'm maybe having a conversation with Joe, or maybe I didn't get that time, or maybe he's not willing to provide it. I just know his name is Joe. I'm going to call him Joe Red Hat, and I'm going to search for him again and then enter this client into the system. I'm going to add him as a new client. It's going to ask me to search again, so we'll search again. And now that I saw no duplicates detected, I can enter his full, made-up last name, Joe Red Hat. Obviously, this is not a full name, so we're going to record partial name. We'll just say client refused, or we'll say data not collected for the rest of this. We'll just assume I did not get to ask my client any of these questions. So we're going to record data not collect all the way across. We're hoping that we maybe at least ask, hey, Joe, are you a veteran? And if he says, yes or no, we'll say no for sake of time. Okay, we're going to finish to races required. And I'll scroll down and do data not collected for that as well. Okay, so now Joe is in the system. We have a lot of information that's data not collected, but he has a client ID, he's in the system. We're not going to record any family members for now. I'm just going to enroll him in a street outreach program. That went too far. Here we go. Do we have a training one? Let's do City House. Not playing favorites, I just picked one. Okay, so Joe is enrolling in our program. His project start date, let's say I encountered him on the street yesterday. Okay, here as I enter him, I have the option to record a date of engagement, but I'm not going to record it right now because I haven't engaged him. I barely know anything about Joe. So just a project start date, and that's it. As I go through the rest of the assessment, I have no clue whether or not, where he was. Maybe I got to ask him where he was sleeping the night before, but maybe not. I haven't gotten to ask him any of these questions, so I'm going to record data not collected. Approximate date homelessness started. Well, I'm going to assume yesterday, unless, he's able to tell me otherwise. But at least I know for sure yesterday he was homeless, probably. Data not collected for disabling condition. So I think I'll have to go in and choose data not collected for each one of these as well. And I could probably select all, but just making sure we get each one there. I'll record data not collected for domestic violence experience, data not collected for income, right? I just met him on the street this one time. I know nothing about Joe. But I can tell you I met him on the street and he's living in a place that's not meant for human habitation. So here's current living situation. It's going to be part of that intake every time. Even though I didn't record a date of engagement, the client's not engaged. I can at least make a best guess if I met this client on the streets that he's probably living in a place, in one of these homeless situations. If he happens to mention that he's staying at some sort of shelter, then I can record that. That would also be a red flag for me to maybe I should really go try to find him in the system if he says he's staying at a shelter that I know enters data into HMIS. After I choose that current living situation, I'll click Save and click Finish to close my workflow. And now Joe is in the system. He's got his de-identified, red hat because that's all I could get. We don't know a lot of information about him, but he's in there. Now, if I wanted to record his current living situation, maybe tomorrow, well, this was technically he was enrolled yesterday, right? So maybe today, I go out, I see Joe again, I'm talking to him. He doesn't give me any more information. I don't learn anything new about him. But I did see him again, asked him how he was doing. So I'm going to click on current living situation here. I've already, well, let's start from the beginning. Say it's a new day. I just logged in. I'm going to go to find client. I'm going to search for Joe, red hat. I'm going to find him in the system. Make sure I open my menu here and under profile, go down to current living situation. I can see the current living situation that was recorded at entry. And then, ignore those notifications, y'all. I'm going to click add new current living situation, and you can see it's just the same page with the same required fields. Maybe he's still living on the street. I do need to choose an enrollment here. So you can't just find a client that's not enrolled in your program and record current living situation. You'll have to enroll them in your program first. But now that he's enrolled, I can choose my enrollment, choose the current living situation, and save. If I wanted to add details, so if I wanted to say, eighth and Main or whatever, then I can put that information so that other outreach workers, are aware of that's where I saw him. But you don't have to. That location detail is not required. That's optional. So that's how it's going to work both inside and outside of the workflow. Tammy, it's really quick and easy to record. It's not something that's going to take you a lot of time. You'll just need to mark that in the system. Take a look at some other questions. I really briefly, before we have about 20 more minutes, and I am definitely going to take the time to answer all of these questions. But just in case anyone pops off early, I do want to really quickly remind you guys to sign in for this training. And your sign-in options will be, if you will just put your project type, when it asks you for your program's project type, put street outreach and only choose street outreach for me just for this training. And then for type of HMIS training, if you'll choose HMIS projects, and I'm going to put those links in the chat so that you can sign in if you do need to hop off before 11:30. But we are going to spend the next 20 minutes going through everyone else's questions. I just don't want to lose anybody before everybody logs off. Because I see 73 people on this call right now. So when I run my report at the end of the month, I want to see that 73 people signed in for this training. And I want you guys to get your certificate saying you came to this training too. Okay, what other questions do we have? Let's see. I'm going to try to start from the top of the chat and work down. That's what I have been doing, so I'm trying to make sure I don't miss anybody. Sharon, your question about the city not have, so it says, with City of Plano, we don't have case management services, so how will your documentation differ for determining whether or not a client is engaged? I think you can go off of, I think you can go specifically off of HUD's guidance of anytime that you're able to sit down and intentionally do an assessment with that client, then that's when you would record the date of engagement for that client. So if you're not offering case management, then that wouldn't, that wording of your client's, beginning a case management plan maybe doesn't apply, but anytime that you're able to sit down and intentionally do the intake assessment with that client and the client is agreeing to be a part of your program and is wanting to, work with you to help get whatever services you do provide or change their situation, then that's when you would record that. Tyler, your question, if you edit the entry assessment to update. So it depends on the information that you're trying to record. So let's say now, maybe I see Joe today and he tells me his last name. So I can go in and edit this. I don't have to go through the workflow to edit any of this information that shows up here in the top part of this page. I can just click on the title of this section, Joe's information, and then change name, social security number, date of birth, ethnicity, race, gender, veteran status, and contact information if you have any. So maybe his name is Joe Smith, and I can record full name at this point maybe, and then click finish, and that's if you're, just editing demographic information, anything up here, that's easy. If you're wanting to edit anything on those later pages in the workflow. So I'm going to go in and choose Edit Project Entry Workflow just to walk you through some of this. You do have the option to change demographic information in the workflow as well. So you could, just like we did on the last page, update any of that and choose Finish. For now, I'm going to choose No Changes. I'm going to save and close on the family members page because I'm not going to record any family members. I'm still not going to record a date of engagement. Maybe I'm not doing a full intake with Joe, but he just, gave me a little more information as I was talking to him, so I'm going to choose no changes there. Maybe we'll say we didn't get anything more about his universal data or barriers or domestic violence, but maybe in a conversation with Joe, he says, yeah, I've been out of work for a while, haven't been able to make any money. Well, then you know that that client's income, that he did not have any income, right? So you can go back through this entry assessment. This is true for your client at entry. So that's why you're going back through the entry assessment to go back and record no and update that information. So maybe he didn't say anything about other benefits, but he said, I haven't had any work for a while. I've not been making any money. Then you can go ahead and record no, save and close, and now that information's been updated. Notice that I have to record current living situation again, even though I'm editing this workflow because it's a new day, right? So even like if I'm going back to edit this information, I'm assuming that's because something has changed. If you do want to, maybe you didn't contact this client, you realize you just made an error that you need to correct, like a spelling error or something, you can go back and enter the same day that you initially contacted the client and the same answer. And just record that there. So now I've got a little more income information about Joe, but I still haven't engaged him. I still haven't gone through a whole intake with him. If I did engage Joe at any point, then I would choose my action arrow, come down here to Update/Annual Assessment, and this is where I would record the date of engagement. So I'm engaging Joe today, and click Save. I'm going to do a new update or during program enrollment assessment. And this is the point where I would not want to be recording data not collected, because by recording the date of engagement, I'm telling the system I was able to sit down with my client and ask him these questions. So at this point, I would then want to go in and say, yes or no, he is or is not covered by health insurance. You're going to have to probably go back into the entry assessment to update their disabling condition. I'm just going to cancel this workflow to show you why. That's part of this basic information is, I thought so, maybe not. I saw it somewhere else just a minute ago, and I thought that's going to have to be changed in the entry. So if it's barrier information and you've already recorded data not collected or no, and you need to update that, go through the entry workflow so that you are able to update those barriers in later assessments. But hopefully, that flow gives you guys a little better understanding of how that works. So current living situation, any workflow, or outside the workflow at any point, date of engagement only once you're able to sit down with your client and get all of that information. Tracy, your question was about, is there a timeline for when date of engagement needs to be entered? Is it within 2 calendar days? Our timeliness requirement specifically refers to data quality and the things that are reported on that data quality report. So that timeliness requirement for the data quality report is, that report is not looking at date of engagement. That being said, I would get that information in as soon as you can because, let me say this. I want to backtrack because I feel like that could be unclear. Only the timeliness question for the data quality report, it's not looking at date of engagement to determine the timeliness error. It's looking at assessment dates to determine the timeliness error. Date of engagement definitely affects your data quality report, right? We've talked a lot about that, so I feel like I just worded that very poorly to say it's not looking at date of engagement. It's looking at date of engagement to pull the right clients, and then it's looking at assessment dates to determine the timeliness. So because date of engagement is not a date that's tied to, it's not an assessment date, it's a different data element, the timeliness, you won't see a timeliness error for waiting longer than 2 days to record your date of engagement. Still, that being said, that doesn't mean you should just like take forever to enter it right, because you want to get that information up to date as soon as possible. If you're recording it as an update assessment, for example, let's say in this case it's been 2 weeks, right? I met with Joe, it's been 2 weeks, and I'm finally able to sit down and do a full assessment with him. I'm going to record that date of engagement as an update assessment, and then I'm going to go through the update assessment and record all the answers that he had to those questions. So the date of engagement won't necessarily affect the timeliness. However, if I go into that update assessment a week from now and say 1 week ago I sat down with Joe, I engaged him, and I got all these questions answered, then that 1 week difference in your update assessment will affect your timeliness. So actually I think it's just entry and exit. Frida, is that right?
Timeliness is only measured for program entries and program exits.
Okay, so the update assessment, it won't be affected. Again, not an excuse just to wait forever to enter that data. We want to get it in as soon as possible. Let's see. Catherine, great question. So you meet CJ, you get limited data, you put him in, and then unfortunately you never see him to complete that data again. It's not going to show up as as missing data in your report or in your data quality report. It's not going to show up as an error because you never recorded date of engagement for that client. So you meet CJ, you put his name in, never hear from him again. That data not collected is not going to affect your data quality at all, as long as you don't record a date of engagement.
Is there a way to remove the date of engagement?
Is there a way to remove date of engagement?
If you accidentally, because you were moving too fast, just clicked over and hit date of engagement without all the data collected, is it just about submitting a ticket saying, hey, I hit this unintentionally?
Frida, I'm not sure about that. Frida, can you answer that question?
You should be able to remove it because you should be able to remove that on your own, because date of engagement is not a required field when you're in your workflow or when you're outside of your workflow, right? So Megan has it on your screen because it's not required. If you accidentally recorded the date of engagement, you would just edit, let's say the entry workflow or you would edit, the entry workflow or whichever workflow you recorded that date of engagement in, and just remove the date.
Thanks, Frida. So I just went through, because I recorded it as an update assessment, I went through update. You have to record, you have to take it off initially and then just tell the system that you're editing an existing assessment. Choose that assessment that you already did where you accidentally recorded the date of engagement. And then you could, if you're not making any other changes, you can just do no changes or save and close until you get to the end of that workflow. That's a great question. Thank you. And I learned something new too. Let's see. So Paul, your question, I'm reading your question in the chat. It says, to piggyback off of Catherine, maybe you meet CJ one day and he says his name is CJ. The next day he says his name is Bob. The next day, you know, someone else sees him and he says his name is Fred, but his actual name is David. So he's in, you know, maybe he's already actually receiving services from another organization and now he has several different entries in the system. That's where we as a community just have to be, you know, looking through the system, looking at more than just the client's name when we're trying to determine whether or not it's the same client. And what the system actually does on the back end is looks for those things as well. So if someone is entered with like the same date of birth, same social, similar names, then that is flagged as a potential duplicate. And we regularly, the HMIS team regularly goes and checks for duplicates in the system and merges records where we can. Frida, do you want to add more to that?
No.
Okay, I couldn't tell if you came off of mute to say something or if you were just hanging out. but we are regularly going through as the HMIS admins and making sure that we're removing those duplicates when they do get recorded, because it is inevitable at some point we're going to have duplicates in the system. So that's a great question, Paul. Thank you. Let's see. Is the point of this to capture the accurate number of people homeless? So say we speak with an MBR that we know may have been in the system at some point, but it's not in our program at the moment, and we're talking with them. Do they enter them into the program? If you know they might have been in the system at some point, if you're, I think to Frida's point earlier, if you're working as a street outreach worker and you're talking with that client and you know they're homeless, yes, we want to get that client into the system. If you are, if you think they've already been in the system, then search through those clients' records and try to find a client in the system. And if not, then yeah, you're going to create that new enrollment. But either way, I think if you're working as a street outreach worker, you're talking with that person and they're homeless, then yes, you're going to put that enrollment in. Let's see. Paul, your question from new user training, we talk about our goal for data quality is 0% data not collected and 5% client doesn't know, but that seems really counterintuitive. So that data quality, when we talk about 0% of data not collected errors or 0% client doesn't know errors, let me pull up a report quickly and I'll show you. Let me try anyway to find an old report. See if I can find one, y'all. Okay, so this is a data quality report, and what we're looking at here is an error rate. So when we say we want 0% of data not collected or 0% client doesn't know, this is what we're looking at. So here you can see we have one client in this program who's missing, who didn't know a social security number. If the social security number was missing, it would show up here and we'd have this error rate. Numbers only pull to this report after the date of engagement is recorded. So there are clients in this emergency shelter program. Emergency shelter is similar. There are clients in this program maybe who have, been entered. Let me actually, I have a data quality. I think I have a street outreach one. That's the validation. Where's my... That's the training one. I can't find the right report, y'all. Those numbers are only pulling to that report when the date of engagement is recorded. So if you're getting just very little information, you're not recording date of engagement at that point, and those numbers aren't going into those error counts. Let's say, for training type, for the sign-in, I know some people are asking, and maybe it's a little late. If you'll put HMIS projects as the training type, I would appreciate that. What other questions do we have? We're coming up the last few minutes.
I got a question.
Sure.
Okay, so if the idea is to get people into HMIS, let's say, for instance, somebody is, let's say the first of the month, they have enough money, they go get a hotel. But for 3 weeks out of the month, they're out on the street. Or let's say they panhandle for money. So they may, like 2 or 3 nights a week, get a hotel, but the rest of the time they're out on the streets. Do you want us entering people in to HMIS with that, even though they're ending their homelessness every time they go into a hotel?
That's a great question. I don't know if yes, Frida.
Okay.
I don't know if I feel confident to answer that question.
Sure thing. As a reminder, when a client is in a living situation, right, they're no longer in a homeless situation, and they're in this living situation for greater than 7 days, right, that is a break in homelessness. So to piggyback off of what you just said, John, like in the example that you use 3 days, right? So that's not a break in homelessness. If a client is staying at a hotel or motel for less than 7 days, that's not a break in homelessness. Only if they're staying there for greater than 7 days, then that is a break in homelessness. And you all may have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it is my understanding that as street outreach workers, right, you're making contact with these clients while they're in a homeless situation, right? You're not necessarily going to hotels and motels and making contacts with clients there. So as a street outreach worker, you want to enroll that client in HMIS when you make initial contact with them on the streets, and continue to record that living situation when you're making contact with that client on the streets. One of the current living situation questions, you know, that you, in current living situation, there's a drop-down box, and that drop-down box is the client still in a homeless situation, or are they not in a homeless situation? So I'll give you an example. Maybe a client has an enrollment in HMIS, you know, at the first of the, let's just say on the 15th of the month, and you've recorded the client in HMIS, you've recorded their current living situation, that they're still on the streets. But let's just say a week later, right, the client is going to get their check and they're going to go pay for, or they're panhandling enough to get a hotel stay for a night or two. But you're still making contact with that client on the streets, and that's when you get that information. Hey, I've been in a hotel for the past 2 days. When you record your current living situation, in that drop-down box is where you would choose that the client is not in a homeless situation. That's how you would record that example in HMIS. Does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, I'm just running into a lot more, and I know everybody else is too. It's kind of been a debate we've had on whether or not to enter these folks into HMIS, because I'm putting them in, or I may be looking up somebody that's already in there, and I see that they're listed as a place not meant for habitation, but they've been staying in a hotel for the last few days to a week. If it's somebody that gets income, gets disability or something, they may stay for the first week and a half or something, so that breaks their homelessness. I'm not sure. I may not, I don't obviously go to hotels to meet with people, but when they're out on the streets, when I'm documenting it, but as we get to know them, we're finding out that they do stay in a hotel for a week and a half, 2 weeks maybe, in a hotel. What are we supposed to do with that?
I was just pulling this up to show, to Frida's point, those non-homeless situations. So here's a hotel paid for without emergency shelter vouchers, and then you get additional questions as you answer these questions. So if the person is not in a homeless situation, you may have to get more information if you can about how long they're expected to be there. And of course, if you need to record client doesn't know, or if you weren't able to ask them that question, then that's fine as well. Really
John,
quickly,
I think that we will have to get back to you with that question, because Megan, go back. Because when they are staying at these hotels, this hotel is not paid by a shelter or a voucher. It is that they just got their Social Security and they are spending the first week of each month in a shelter. And that is very typical within our unsheltered population. So let me check. What I have seen doing for the outreach teams is that they, even if they go and give a hygiene kit to one of the clients that for that week they are staying, they are literally homeless. They are outside. But let us get back to you with that question, with that answer, okay? I don't want to give you the wrong answer, but definitely hotel and motel pay, maybe pay without emergency shelter voucher. Maybe. Let us get back to you, please.
All right, appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. Anita, I see your hand raised. I want to get to your question. I just want to really quickly, because I know a lot of you have to hop off. We are at time. Thank you so much for attending. If you do need to leave, I'm going to stay on and answer all the questions that we have, so I don't want anyone to feel like you're rushed off. But thank you, everyone. I hope that this training has been really informative. There is a feedback link in the chat if you would like to provide feedback that's anonymous. We always want to hear what you thought about training. Also, I wanted to really quickly point out that Jeanette from Promise House gave some awesome information in the chat about encountering youth or older youth. And then there was one more Chance at Recovery Resource Council. They're hosting a free pet services event this weekend as well. So you can get that information in the chat if you're more interested in those little plugs that they were giving. Thank you guys for sharing that. We're a community and we work together to serve our community. So no shame in plugging your events and your services. Anita, what's your question? Or maybe your hand got accidentally raised. If you do have a question and you want to type it in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, I'm happy to answer that. Did anyone else have any other questions before we log off? I want to make sure everyone got the chance to talk out their questions if you have them.
I did want to add something, Megan. This is Stephanie from MDHA.
Sure.
I did respond to John's question that he had earlier. So he was asking about the client's time homeless, like if they're in a hotel or a motel that they're paying for. Remember that HUD only expects if the client is homeless for 1 day within that month, they're considered as homeless for that entire month, right? So as far as like them, you being able to determine if they're currently homeless, if you meet them and they say that they're at a hotel and they're paying for it, if you meet them the next month and they're telling you the same thing, then that's something totally different. If you've already recorded a current living situation, let's say for the month of April, you record that current living situation already, and then you go back out and, in another day in the month of April, and they tell you that they're staying in a hotel that they're paying for, that's fine. You can record it as a hotel paid for by the client, but that client is still going to have that month of April that's going to count as time homeless, because they don't need to be homeless 1 day in that month to be recorded as that month of homelessness, right? So the client needs to make sure, the case manager needs to make sure that the client is going to be homeless the day before they're referred to a housing agency. Let's say that they're already added to the HPL and they're referred to a housing agency, and that housing agency is trying to enter them and enroll them into their project. They only need to make sure that they are homeless the night before. So if they're homeless the night before being enrolled into that housing project, then that's fine. As far as any other time homeless or whatever, if you have that information recorded in HMIS as a current living situation, and because they were homeless when you engaged with them at that time, you'll get rewarded, or that day that they were actually homeless will count as that month of homelessness.
This is
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that makes sense.
Okay.
I'm trying to do that sign in, and I can't figure out on this computer how to scroll the chat to get the correct name of the program. I thought I screenshotted it, but what do we say? We say street outreach for the name of the program that we will enter data for?
Your name of the program is going to be whatever your program is, so GPU Street Outreach or whatever you call that. For project type or program type, you'll choose Street Outreach in one of the check boxes. And then for the type of training, if you can choose remote HMIS projects.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. And I did see your question in the chat, Frida. Thank you for answering that, Tammy. If you find out that you made an approximate date homelessness started, and you find out later that it was actually a different date, a lot further back than what you thought, you can definitely go in and edit that as well. You would edit your entry workflow to update that information.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. Any other questions before we log off? This has been awesome. I love the discussion that's being had around these topics. So you guys are, I appreciate you guys a lot. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I think I got everybody.
I think I did it wrong on the sign in, but I can't figure out this laptop yet. So
That's okay, Tammy. I can always make the edit on my side if we need to, or, you know, as long as you're able to submit something, then I think you'll be good to go.
thank you. Thank you. Good training.
No worries. Thanks, Tammy. I don't want the training sign-in to be your biggest constraint while you're leaving today. So if you can't figure it out, we'll get that worked out. Let's see. I'm going to send that sign-in link again. Thank you all for caring about the sign-in link. I appreciate that. I'll also send it, I'll try to send it as a follow-up, or if you need the sign-in link and you're having trouble, you can also submit a SpiceWorks ticket and I can work with you there if you're still having issues. It doesn't seem like we have any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end this training. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the work that you do. You guys are incredible. Our community would not be where it is without you. We appreciate you so much and the work that you do for the people in our community. Thank you for attending training today. I appreciate you all taking the time to be here. I do want to hear if you think that it was helpful, so there is that feedback link as well. If you're interested in giving feedback, I'll put that one in the chat also. We always want to hear feedback, positive or negative. If you liked it or hated it, I want to hear about that. And we really appreciate you guys. So everyone have a wonderful rest of your Thursday and enjoy the rest of your week. And we'll see you at the next one. Bye, you all.